David Matthiessen has been exploring the connections between the star world myths and finds evidence that around the world, the ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories share a common system of celestial metaphor.
Let's illustrate by examining a few example myths from around the world and see how they're connected by the stars and what they might be pointing to esoterically. This is a painting depicting the famous episode of the Judgment of Solomon in the Book of Kings, when Solomon has asked the Lord for wisdom in order to be able to judge rightly, in order to help the people. Immediately after that, this episode takes place in which the scriptures tell us that two harlots have a child 3 days apart from one another. And one of the women overlays the child in the night, it's said, and the child dies. And they argue over which one belongs to which woman. They both live in the same house. There's nobody else in the house with them. They both have a child. One child dies, and they go before Solomon, and one woman says, "This other woman overlay her baby in the night, and it died, and then she switched it with mine. She took my live baby and gave me the dead one." And then the other one says, "No, the live baby is mine, the dead baby is hers." And Solomon says, "How am I going to resolve this dilemma?" The two babies were obviously very close together in age, born only 3 days apart, and each of the women is claiming that the live one belongs to her and the dead one belongs to the other. How can I resolve this dispute? And so the text tells us that Solomon calls for a swordsman, and he directs the swordsman, "Cut that baby in half, the living one. I know how I'll solve this problem. Give half of the baby to each of the two women, and then the argument will be over." And then, of course, one woman says, "Wait a minute, don't do that. Anything but that. Don't cut the baby in half. Just go ahead and give it all to her without harming it." And the other one says, No, I think that's a good idea. Why don't you cut it in half?" And the scriptures say that Solomon immediately saw through the problem at that point, and he says, "That one there who said, 'Don't cut it in half,' that's the real mother. Even though she said, 'Give it to the other one,' that's because she loves her child and doesn't want it to die. Give the baby to her. That's the real mother." And it says that the wisdom of Solomon was marveled at throughout the land because of this judgment. Now, the way this scene is very commonly depicted throughout the centuries gives us clues to its celestial foundations. Notice I'm not saying that the paintings actually prove this, but it is a fact. I don't know that this fact has been pointed out by anybody else, but it is a fact that these artistic conventions match up with specific constellations. Now, I'm going to emphasize one more time, we don't need the artwork to prove that these stories are based on the stars. We can do that with the texts themselves, but the artwork gives a very visually appealing and immediately recognizable confirmation that this tradition continued down through the centuries. We can see this in artwork from ancient times, from hundreds and even thousands of years BC or BCE, and we can see it operating all the way up through the Renaissance and really into the modern period, the 1800s. It really only breaks down with the advent of what we call modern art. That was the rejection of these conventions that had held for so many centuries. And so when sacred scenes are depicted, specifically in Western European artwork, we're talking about sacred scenes from the Bible, but this holds true across different cultures. But these scenes from the Bible, such as this one by Peter Paul Rubens, they employ these artistic conventions which match up with specific constellations and give us clues to the celestial foundations of the story. So let's just take a look at the outline of the swordsman. In this particular picture, the angle is a little bit more front on, but you can still see these conventions in operation. The swordsman here is holding a baby who is in this hard arch, and that is a very common pattern in depictions of the Judgment of Solomon. You can see it over and over down through the centuries, this baby arching like this. And now let's look at the swordsman. He has 1 foot behind, and if we were looking at him more in profile, you would see that that knee would be bent and the heel would be raised. You can still see the heel raised off the ground there. And then he's got a narrow waist and a broad, powerful build, wide shoulders, and basically a square-shaped head emphasized often by a full beard. And then he is brandishing a sword over his back, menacingly, raising this powerful sword over his back, and then with one arm, the other arm is going to be reaching out and grasping this arching baby. Now, let's take a look at the constellations in the night sky, that this story is based on. The king directs a swordsman to cut the baby in half. When I was little, I used to think it was the king actually grabbing a sword and pretending that he was about to cut the baby in half. But if you read the text, it says that Solomon said, cut the baby in half. And then at the last minute, he says, stop, don't cut it in half, after the 2 women have exclaimed, don't do it, or yes, go ahead and do it. Then he says, stop. Well, obviously, if he was holding the sword himself, if he had been holding the sword himself, he wouldn't have had to say stop. So he's talking to someone else. He's directing a swordsman. And in the sky, the figure that is holding a sword, this powerful figure that's holding a sword, in this same posture that we see in the artwork, is the constellation Hercules. It's a very powerful looking outline, although the stars are actually fairly faint. So this is a very interesting example. Hercules is an extremely important constellation mythologically, playing mythological figures, Hercules being one of them, but many, many other mythological figures, not always male, sometimes female, but a very important celestial figure playing this role in myths around the world, and yet not a very easy constellation to trace out in the sky. So it's very interesting that around the world, this figure plays this role consistently with consistent features. But let's take a look at the similarities to the outline of the swordsman that you can see in various examples of artwork depicting the Judgment of Solomon. There's the heel raised with his deep lunge of the back leg bent, and then the figure itself is powerful looking with a narrow waist and broad shoulders. There's the distinctive square-shaped head that will often show up in myths as a figure with a full beard, but not always. But often that square-shaped head will be incorporated in the myth or in the artwork, including ancient artwork around the world. And then one arm is obviously brandishing this big, powerful weapon. It could be envisioned as a sword, could be envisioned as a club. The hero Hercules or Hercules often uses a club. It could be envisioned as a thunderbolt. It could be envisioned as an axe. It could be envisioned as a hammer. It plays all those different roles in myths around the world. And then the other arm is distinctively reaching forward, and you can see that in the painting as well. Now, in this painting, the swordsman is grasping a baby, and the baby is arching vigorously, which babies will do when they're angry. If you've ever had to change a diaper on an infant, you know that sometimes they get angry, or if you try to give them a bath and they don't want a bath, they will arch like this sometimes. And there is a constellation very close to Hercules. In fact, directly in front of the constellation Hercules is this beautiful constellation called the Northern Crown, Corona Borealis. And it's 7 stars, you can see them right there, in a beautiful arch, and that is very visible. That is something that, that is a constellation that around the world you might imagine that even without contact between different cultures, they might look up at this beautiful arc of 7 stars and envision a crown or a necklace. But in this case, that arch of stars is being envisioned as a baby, which is actually a bit of a obscure and interesting correlation that you wouldn't really expect to find in myths in cultures that are supposedly disconnected from one another by thousands of miles or thousands of years or even separated by vast oceans, and yet you do. So why would the figure of Hercules be envisioned sometimes as grasping an arcing baby? Because if you imagine just one additional line in between the forward-reaching arm of Hercules, the constellation, and the arc of the Northern Crown, you can envision the stars of Hercules, the figure, the outline of Hercules, grasping the Northern Crown. And in this case, it is the baby that is arching. The Northern Crown is being envisioned as a baby. Now, who then is King Solomon? Who's directing the swordsman to cut that baby in half and then at the last moment saying, stop? Who could Solomon be? I'm going to argue, and there's abundant evidence to back this up, scriptural evidence that I can point to and I have written about and talked about in some of my videos and online courses and books, that supports the assertion that King Solomon is identified with the constellation Ophiuchus, located directly below Hercules in the heavens. And I'm going to show a little bit of that evidence, but believe me, there is abundant evidence to support an identification of Solomon with the constellation of Ophiuchus. And that actually makes very good visual sense just from the paintings that we see down through the centuries. Here's a different depiction of the judgment of Solomon. You can see Solomon sitting on the throne there in between the 2 women who are arguing over whose baby belongs to whom. And then you can see once again the powerful looking swordsman off to the left holding the baby. And again, the baby is arcing vigorously in a hard arch position. But let's take a look at Solomon. What's interesting about Solomon here is Solomon is enthroned in between 2 pillars, and that is a very common association for King Solomon. Solomon, of course, presides over the building of the temple, and the temple has these famous pillars on either side. And so Solomon is envisioned as seated between 2 pillars. You can even look at the way this artist has painted the throne. There's 2 pillars there and kind of a scallop shell or a kind of a niche shape over Solomon's head. And he's got his fingers in these kind of interesting posture. Let's take a look at my assertion that Solomon is associated with the constellation Ophiuchus. Look at the 2 sides of Ophiuchus and the central body of Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus is a constellation whose name means the serpent holder or the serpent bearer. And the constellation itself consists of this central body, that tall, rectangular, oblong central body with a triangle on top It kind of looks like a tombstone or an obelisk or a tower. That's the towering central body, and it actually does create that kind of niche shape, the shape of a niche in which you would put the statue of a deity. And on either side, you can envision those two columns there of the central body. And then there's also the two halves of the serpent. On the left side is what we call the serpent's tail, and on the right side is the serpent's head. In the sky, the tail is on the left. When we're facing to the south, that is the east. Actually, the east side is the serpent's tail, and the west side is the serpent's head. It's to the left and to the right of the central body when we're standing in the northern hemisphere. They're going to be on our left and right when we're facing to the south. But look at the hands of Solomon in the painting itself. The artist has put one hand on the serpent's tail side in kind of a flat gesture, which actually resembles the top of that outline of the serpent's tail. And then on the other side, the artist has extended Solomon's fingers so that you can really see three fingers, just like there are three stars that make up the top of the serpent's head on the right-hand side as we look at it, on the west side of Ophiuchus. And so I hope you can see that that outline of Ophiuchus is very evocative of this painting of Solomon that we're looking at here, but also of those two pillars. We can see the two pillars on either side of that central body of Ophiuchus, or you could alternatively say, well, maybe the serpent halves somehow contribute to the two pillars motif of Ophiuchus as well. But Ophiuchus is associated in ancient myth with a tower and sometimes with a temple or with a building with pillars, just like we see it here. And so there's just a little bit of evidence that Solomon is associated with Ophiuchus, but I'm going to show a little bit more in a little bit. Here we have a depiction of the episode of David and Bathsheba. So King David in the scriptures is the father of Solomon. And in one very important episode, one very notorious episode in David's life, he becomes the king and he has basically everything that he wants, everything that he needs, the king over all the people. But one day he's up on his roof and he spies the beautiful Bathsheba at her bath. He goes out onto his roof at night and he sees Bathsheba taking a bath, and he is smitten. He can't stop thinking about her. He becomes obsessed with the beautiful Bathsheba, and then he arranges for her husband to be murdered so that David can take Bathsheba, and that becomes the downfall of King David. But it is also through Bathsheba that David has Solomon. The baby Solomon is a later child of David and Bathsheba and becomes the king after David. So this is a depiction of that episode in which David sees Bathsheba at her bath, and you can see that Bathsheba is there by a fountain, getting some water, and David is looking down and noticing Bathsheba in this painting. But let's take a look at the way that the artist has depicted Bathsheba and how that relates to the celestial identities of the figures in this story, which will also help us shed some light, additional evidence on the identity of Solomon. So first of all, let's focus on Bathsheba. She is taking a bath. In this artist's depiction, it's by a fountain, but a bathing female figure is found in myths around the world. In the ancient Greek myths, goddesses will often be taking a bath in a secluded grotto or beautiful pool in a river. So this figure of a beautiful female figure bathing, I want to point out the similarities in this artwork of Bathsheba to the constellation Sagittarius. Look at the constellation Sagittarius and where it's located in the heavens. It's actually right next to the brightest and the widest part of the Milky Way, which is why sometimes in the myths, a Sagittarius figure will be bathing in a beautiful pool or grotto or river. This is the widest part of the Milky Way. The Milky Way itself could be envisioned as a river, and that widening part could be envisioned as a pool or a secluded grotto or a fountain where a figure associated with Sagittarius might be bathing. And look at the artwork here. She's next to the fountain, just like Sagittarius is next to the Milky Way. And there's a very distinctive aspect of Sagittarius, the way the stars are actually outlined in the sky. I want you to notice, if you look at the actual outline of Sagittarius, the figure itself could be envisioned as walking in one direction. It's like the knees and legs of Sagittarius are pointing towards the left as we look at it, but looking back in the other direction. In fact, pointing the bow back in the other direction, but it looks like her head, or the head of the figure of Sagittarius, because Sagittarius, although it will often play female figures, will sometimes also play male figures. But the aspect of the constellation that I'm pointing out here is that it looks like it's walking in one direction and then looking back or turning back and pointing in the other direction. And if we look at the artwork by Paris Bordoni, we can see that he has depicted Bathsheba next to the fountain as having her knees and hips and legs pointing towards the left, but she's looking back to the right. And in fact, she's got her arms in an outline that very much resembles the outline of the bow of the constellation Sagittarius. Just look at the way he's depicted her there. And then another distinctive feature of the constellation Sagittarius is this plume on top of the triangular head of the outline of Sagittarius. That plume is a feature of the constellation itself, and we can see that Paris Bordoni, in his depiction of Bathsheba, although she's mostly naked because she's preparing for her bath here, he has given her this scarf, and he's got the scarf basically billowing out or flowing out from the top corner of her head, just like the plume in the constellation Sagittarius in the sky. So that's some very intriguing artistic conventions that are being incorporated into this depiction of David and Bathsheba. And then there's David up in the window there. He's described in the scripture as being up on the roof. Who could David be in this scene? Well, if Bathsheba is associated with Sagittarius, and we've just shown some evidence that supports that interpretation, or at least supports the fact that artists down through the centuries appear to depict Bathsheba in a position that is appropriate to Sagittarius, who could David be? In the scriptures, he's described as being up on the roof. So if Bathsheba is Sagittarius, who's up on the roof to look down and see Bathsheba at her bath, bathing there in the Milky Way? Well, I'm going to show you. It's a constellation we've already seen. This is the constellation Hercules, who plays the swordsman in that other biblical story that we were looking at. But Hercules can be shown beyond doubt, and I show this in other places, to be the constellation with which the figure of David is very clearly associated in the scriptures of the Bible. And that makes sense because right next to Hercules, on the other side from the northern crown, is this outline right here. This is an important constellation. It's called Lyra, the lyre. And David, as we know from the text of the Bible, plays on the lyre. He's the sweet singer of Israel. He's the psalmist. He plays on the lyre, which is like a very small harp that you can carry in your hands. It's a stringed instrument with a frame. And there's the constellation Lyra in the sky. It even has two stars that indicate two strings on the musical instrument right next to the constellation Hercules. That is David, and he's up on the roof when he sees Bathsheba. What could that mean? The scripture is giving us a clue. We don't actually need these Renaissance artists to figure it out. You can actually tell from the scriptures themselves who is the roof or what constellation plays the roof that David is on when he sees Bathsheba at her bath. That's Ophiuchus again. And you can see how Ophiuchus basically looks like the outline of a house. You know, if you ask a child to draw a house, it'll look a lot like Ophiuchus many times, with kind of a rectangle with a triangle on top. That's the roof. There's David up on the roof. He sees Bathsheba. So this is additional evidence that Solomon is associated with Ophiuchus. Why? Because Solomon is the son of David. So Solomon is descended from David. So you can see if David is associated with the constellation Hercules, that's why Solomon is associated with Ophiuchus. He's the son of David. And we see that happen in myths a lot. A figure is said to be descended from another figure when that constellation is right next to, often right below, sometimes right above the other constellation. These are clues that are in the actual texts themselves. We don't need the artwork, but the artwork is a very pleasing and satisfying way to see these celestial associations.
But why would the ancient myths around the world encode the constellations as characters and base their storylines on different parts of the night sky? What could be the purpose of such a system?
So I believe that the ancient myths are connecting these figures, these characters and events to the stars as part of this esoteric code, an esoteric language. And in that language, the cycles of the heavens have significance. This is a drawing from the early 1600s of the zodiac wheel, and it's basically depicting the order in which the sun and the moon and the planets moves through the background stars of the zodiac. The way this zodiac wheel or diagram is laid out, the sun goes around clockwise. Like I said, you could lay it out to where the constellations are arranged for the sun to go around counterclockwise. But as we move in our dance with the sun throughout the year, we get this interplay of light and dark, this back and forth between the daylight and the darkness. In the summer months, the hours of daylight get longer and longer, and daylight is longer than darkness during each 24-hour period. But as we go around, we cross down into the darker half of the year where hours of darkness are longer than hours of daylight. And that happens at the equinox. In the northern hemisphere, it's the September equinox that we cross down into the lower half of the year where days are shorter and nights are longer. And at that crossing point is when we descend down into the lower half of the year. That is where the ancient myths associate that point with our descent into matter. The spirit's descent, the soul coming down into a body, being encased in flesh. That's what happens at our first birth, at our physical birth. And the ancient myths use this esoteric language to depict the sun's plunge downward into darkness as we go throughout the annual cycle. The myths use all these different heavenly cycles, but in the annual cycle, when the sun plunges down into the lower half of the year and days start to get shorter and shorter, shorter than nights, that is the first birth, and it takes place at the fall equinox there in the constellation of Virgo. You can see I've placed the mother there who's holding the dead baby. She's pointing right at the constellation Virgo, and Virgo actually in the sky does have a distinctive outstretched arm that this artist may be evoking with this painting. But that is our first birth when we plunge down into the body. And it happens when the sun plunges down, crosses down into the lower half of the year, and days start getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and days actually start becoming shorter than nights at the equinox. And then for 3 months, as the sun passes through the zodiac signs of Libra and Scorpio and Sagittarius, the sun is descending and days keep getting shorter and shorter until we reach basically the lowest point of the year, and that happens at the winter solstice, which for the northern hemisphere is the December solstice. But notice that it is 3 zodiac signs or 3 months after that equinox. The plunge down happens at the equinox. The lowest point happens 3 months later. Now notice in this story of the judgment of Solomon, the 2 babies are born 3 days apart. They're not born 3 months apart, but the 3 days in the story is there to give you an esoteric indication of the 3 months. If the babies were born 3 months apart, it wouldn't really be very difficult for Solomon to do the judgment. He would just say, okay, which of these 2 babies was born first? Because that one's obviously 3 months older than that one. It would have been really easy. But if they're born 3 days apart, then Solomon has this dilemma. But the second birth happens at that lowest point. That's the turning point. That's the point where the sun begins to go back up towards the northern part of the horizon in the northern hemisphere, where the days start to get longer again. That turning point happens at the winter solstice, the very lowest point, and that is in this esoteric system that the ancient myths are using. That is envisioned as the second birth, and that's encoded as the return of spirit, the return of moving back upwards, and it has to do with the recovery of self. You see, this whole system is actually about recovering something that we are suppressing, something that we don't even know that we're suppressing. And that second birth has to do with the recovery of self. And so there's the live baby being lifted up by the Hercules figure, and that all has esoteric significance. The path of Ophiuchus and Hercules rising up above Sagittarius and picking that baby up has to do with the path up along the Milky Way, not along the zodiac. It's a different path. Now, what's really interesting is we can see this rather unusual association, this unexpected association between the constellation Hercules and the constellation of the Northern Crown, and the Northern Crown being envisioned as a baby in other myths around the world as well, not just in the story of Solomon. Here's, of course, the famous Greek myth of Achilles. His divine mother wanted to make Achilles immortal as well, so she dipped him in the river Styx, or in some versions of the story, in a fire. In both cases, it's the Milky Way. But look at the outline of the mother of Achilles. Does this artwork look familiar to you? Does this story possibly have a celestial origin? Here's the outline again of the constellation Hercules. And remember, like I said, Hercules and all these constellations can play a male figure in some myths, a female figure in other myths. In this case, the mother of Achilles is holding her baby by the heel. And here we have the Northern Crown again, just as we saw before, being envisioned as a baby suspended by Hercules. At least in this artwork, the artist has envisioned the mother of Achilles, in the exact same posture as the constellation Hercules. And then we find this pattern of a baby being pulled up out of the water or rescued by a powerful figure in myths from other cultures that you would not expect to have had any contact with the originators of the Solomon story or the originators of the Achilles story. This is a legend from the Polynesian cultures of the Pacific, stretching all the way from Hawaii to Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is the story of Maui, and there's many different versions of the story of Maui, but in the story of Maui, as an infant, Maui is thrown into the sea foam by his mother, or in some versions, it's by his father or by both parents for different reasons, but he's there in the sea foam, and the jellyfish and the seaweed wrap themselves around the baby to try and protect it, but the seabirds and the flies are trying to eat the baby. But then the grandfather of Maui, whose name is Tamanui, rescues the baby, pulls the baby up out of the water, and Tamanui, this powerful grandfather figure, lifts up the baby and hangs him in the rafters to dry over the fire. Again, that is the same pattern that we keep seeing around the world. The constellation Hercules, in this case, is the powerful grandfather Tamanui, who pulls baby Maui out of the water and hangs him up in the rafters over the fire. There's the Milky Way. The Milky Way can be envisioned as a fire. The Milky Way can be envisioned as a river. But this same pattern that we find around the world is based on the stars.
David argues that the ancient myths appear to be using the cycles of the heavens as a kind of language which dramatize aspects of our own condition in this life, using the turning of the heavens to follow the path of the descent of the soul into a body at our physical birth, but also to illustrate our own separation from our authentic self and point our way towards recovery of that same self.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope that this material will be positive for you in some way.